The walls of the enclosed garden separated the fighters of Banu Hanifa from the forces of Khalid. Outside, the field was littered with abandoned shields, broken spears, and men moving from one wounded companion to another. Parched voices called for water. Commanders paced the lines, and wounded warriors leaned against the palms to gather breath. Inside the enclosure, Musaylima prepared for a final stand. The men around him were cut, exhausted, and angry, but they still carried the fierce loyalty of tribal warriors defending their ground. Khalid did not rush the walls. He understood that a narrow choke point favored the defender, and he had no interest in feeding men into a bottleneck where blades could strike with perfect advantage. Instead, he walked the line with armored riders, examining the height of the walls and the position of the defenders above. He halted at an angle where the orchard gave some cover and called for archers to step forward. A volley of arrows forced the defenders to lower their heads and cut down a handful who had been too slow. With the defenders shaken and pinned, Khalid ordered infantry forward in a wedge that pushed directly against one of the weaker entrances. The men at the front carried shields over their heads and pressed into the narrow opening with a slow, grinding force. Spears thrust from both sides, stabbing at gaps in the shields, and men fell in the door frames, trampled by those behind them. The fighting at the threshold was intense and personal. There was no room for archery or cavalry finesse here, only bodies struggling to enter, while others fought to hold them out. After several brutal attempts, the wedge finally forced a breach. A group of fighters led by Thabit ibn Qais and others surged through the entrance, hacking their way into the interior. Once the line cracked, the garden filled rapidly. Narrow lanes between the trees became channels of blood and movement, and the chaos prevented either side from forming a solid front. Men wrestled in clusters, weapons flashing at arm's length. Patches of the garden turned into deadly pockets, where defenders made last stands behind fallen trunks or irrigation troughs. Musaylima continued to fight amid his shrinking circle of guards. He did not flee, for there was nowhere left to go, and surrender would have meant humiliation and likely execution. The chroniclers describe the ferocity of his final resistance, noting that he continued issuing orders even as more of his warriors fell around him. It was in this final phase that Washi ibn Harb, a warrior skilled with the spear, entered the enclosure. Spotting Musaylima among the defenders, Washi hurled his spear with practiced precision. The weapon found its mark, striking Musaylima and dropping him to the ground. Other fighters closed in, finishing the confrontation that had defined the entire battle. With Musaylima dead, resistance collapsed rapidly. Those who survived either threw down their weapons or attempted to flee through the far side of the enclosure, only to be cut down or captured. The fighting inside the garden slowly diminished until only groans and short cries remained. Outside, as word spread of Musaylima death, men lowered their swords and leaned against date palms, letting exhaustion wash over them. When the field was finally secured, the true cost of the battle became clear. The number of dead was heavy on both sides. Early Muslim sources attest to the extraordinary losses among the Quran reciters, some listing several hundred killed, while modern historians place total fatalities likely in the high hundreds to low thousands combined. For Medina, it was a victory, but a costly one. Abu Bakr, upon hearing the reports, was struck not only by the scale of the fighting, but by the loss of so many who carried the Quran in memory. That concern would later drive the decision to unify the Quran in written form, to preserve what might otherwise be lost as the generation of early believers passed in battle. The defeat of Musaylima and the conquest of Yamama marked the true end of the Ridda threat. The most powerful rebel state in Arabia had been broken, its leader killed in the field, and its lands opened to submission and treaty. The road from Yamama back to Medina was no longer blocked by a rival polity, and the peninsula now stood, for the first time, under a single political center. It was after these events that Abu Bakr began to look outward, beyond the desert frontiers, toward the empires that had once loomed over Arabia. The armies forged in the Ridda were blooded, organized, and accustomed to rapid maneuver. Ahead of them lay Iraq, the Sassanid Empire, and the long frontier of the Byzantines. The next campaign was about to begin.